Uh, Hello and welcome everyone to Forum for Global Studies' latest podcast. Here we invite prominent changemakers and academic personalities of eminence to share their insights on the burning topics of relevance in the present times. I, Nandini Ghosh, Research Fellow at the Center for Indo-Pacific Studies at Forum for Global Studies, feel extremely happy and pleased to welcome you, Professor Babones, in this session of podcast featuring assessing India's soft power potential in this polarized global order. Friends, Dr. Babones is an eminent voice in research areas of current geopolitics. He is also the executive director of Indian Century Roundtable. Professor Babones is an eloquent speaker and a reputed author. Some of his great work features the international structure of income, its implications for economic growth, 16 for 16, a progressive agenda for better America, Tianjia, Chinese money, American power, and the middle income trap, etc. So I welcome you, Professor, once again on this session of the podcast.
It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah. So I would like to start by asking you, Professor, that India's soft power story has been an amazing one, given its civilizational inlaid values, which it has, and India has never been assertive about its power, rather being so polite to create a sustainable future together. So what's your take on this, Professor?
I'm sorry to be a contrarian. I actually think India's soft power is far underweight for India's prominence in the world. India should be playing a much larger role in the world and in the global consciousness in soft power terms. And India really does not register at anything like the level it should. I mean, take, for example, the global popularity of yoga. Now, everyone who thinks about it knows that yoga is a spiritual practice that originates in India, but most people don't think about it. For most Americans or Europeans who practice yoga, it's simply a form of exercise, and they may be vaguely aware that it originates in India. They certainly don't think that they are somehow participating in Indian culture when they do it. Contrast that with something like Chinese, morning Tai Chi exercises. People are very aware that Tai Chi is Chinese, and they would associate the exercises with the culture. That is, they would realize that they're connecting with China when they do Tai Chi. They think of it as a very Chinese practice. So I think India can and should be doing much more to be leveraging its soft power, but it has an uphill struggle to remind people that things like yoga originate in India. That to get Bollywood going to a global audience, not just to a South Asian and Middle Eastern audience, to have a real respect for Indian nonviolence, and to realize that India has long been a force for peace in the world, as opposed to U.S. and European countries that have consistently been forces for good or for bad, but forces for war in the world. So India has a lot of soft power potential that I think is severely underutilized.
Very nice, Professor. Very nicely elaborated it. So I would like to again ask the question in repetition, and it would be like India believes in coexistence, and history stands for testimony to it. So how do you view India's credibility in this sense and soft power potential?
Again, I'm sorry to be contrarian, but I think that India has not fully leveraged its potential here. So if people in the West who think of India today tend to associate India with Hindu-Muslim violence and confrontation, intercommunal violence in India. Now, that's not the story of India. Intercommunal violence is very rare in India. We have survey data showing that both among Hindus and among Muslims, that intercommunal violence is the lowest ranked when they're asked to rank major problems they face in India. Peaceful coexistence is very much the way India has been for as long as India has been an independent country, and arguably for long before that, into its earlier civilization. But that's not, there's very little global awareness of that. That's not the image that India has in the world, even if it's the reality of India past and India today. So again, I think India can and should be doing a lot more to promote and spread that image of the country as a country that promotes peaceful coexistence, as opposed to a country that is a locus of violence.
The reach out to the Indian diaspora. And this parliamentary panel report for more synergy and coordination to harness this unique potential is a progressive step. From taking yoga to the global platform to hosting heads of states to different cities has been a very positive exertion. What do you way ahead, Professor, in this regard?
The Indian diaspora is an incredible force for good for India's image on the global stage. Now, that's true in the United States, where India has so many business leaders reflected in the diaspora, but it's also very visible here in Australia, where the Indian diaspora is very much at the forefront of promoting positive Australia-India relations. And we've seen that specifically in the events organized, for example, for Mr. Modi when he's visited the United States and Australia. Those events being organized not by governments, but by members of the Indian diaspora. Similarly, when business delegations from the US or Australia visit India, those delegations are almost always coordinated by firms that are staffed by members of the diaspora. That is, the Indian diaspora is playing that ambassadorial role in introducing American businesses and Western businesses in general, as well as subnational government leaders, bringing state premiers, bringing US state governors and state legislators to India to learn more about India. So absolutely, the diaspora is key here to the emerging relationship between India and the West.
Professor, I would like to ask another question in this regard. As India is presiding G20 this time, and there is a big global event, and India has been engaging with every section of the society in this regard, and it has taken the meetings of some power corridors to the peoples of India and streets of India. It has engaged the students and every communities that is possible. So how do you see India's role in this G20 in taking every section of the society together in formulation of a policy that runs the world? How do you see it?
It is quite possible that India's leadership of the G20 will be the last relevant leadership of the G20. I'm sorry to say it, but the G20 is not a very relevant organization in the world today. Of course, it was formed in the wake of the global financial crisis. It served its purpose, but at this point, I don't think anybody really pays much attention to the G20. And I think you can see that by looking at last year's G20 in Indonesia, which attracted virtually no international interest. Now, the reason India has attracted so much interest in leading the G20 is that India has invested it with importance, and people are very eager to be part of the India story. But I think the G20 has served simply as a platform for India, not as an important organization in itself. Looking forward, I don't think India is likely to play an important role in the G20. I think India is likely to play an increasingly important role instead in the G7. That is the traditional, or at least the historically the most important organization for global economic governance has been the G7. India has been essentially a permanent guest at the G7 for the last 5 years, and it's likely to become, I think, a formal member of the G7, if not next year, then very soon. With India becoming very soon the world's third largest economy and the second largest democratic economy, I think it's inevitable that India will assume a leadership role in the G7, which will become once again a G8. When that happens, I think the G20 will simply fall by the wayside as being just another international organization that has outlived its purpose.
As we discuss the soft power potential of India,
sorry, I didn't get the question.
We are talking about India reaching out to the world community. United extraction of the world today is that movement of uniting the global south and taking their agenda forward. As India is very credible voice in the West, and India's also credible history of cooperation with the global south. How do you see India's role in global south, given India's soft power potential?
I think India has a serious role to play as a quote-unquote Vishwaguru, but I think that is not so much as a Vishwaguru of economic development, which is how Mr. Modi uses the term, but India as a Vishwaguru of democracy. We've seen that the United States really doesn't know how to promote democracy in the world. It's tried and failed repeatedly to promote democracy in developing countries. Yes, the U.S. historically had successes in Germany and Japan, but those were already very well-developed countries at the time the U.S. engaged in democracy promotion. I suspect that India will likely have much more success in coming generations in promoting democracy in the developing world because India has experience in running a democracy at the levels of income that prevail, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. So I see India playing a role as a role model for the developing world, simply because it is, first, because it is not attempting to dominate those countries. There's no fear of India in the developing world, but second, because it shows the way to running a successful democracy. And no other country can really serve as a democratic role model for aspiring democracies in the developing world. That's really where I see India's potential for being a beacon in the future.
Yeah, a very nice answer and engaging one. As you believe that India becoming the Vishwaguru, it is a very welcoming dream for India, and India always attempts to have a very a feeling of cooperation with its growing partners. And I would like to ask you, as you have very much engaging discussions in different matters of India, India is a flourishing democracy with the largest amount of population in a democracy, and India has a very robust democracy, I would like to say, because it is so rooted. So how do you like to say that India succeeding in coming times, in times ahead, in democratizing many relations of the world, and also taking things along with it, as the pandemic has shown us how cruel the things can be. So how do you like to see India's role in times ahead in this regard? And I would like to also add one question in this regard, as like to see that in G7 becoming G8 with presence of India. So how do you see India's role in this in a positive way and from policy perspectives?
First, in the developing world, I think India won't be democratizing countries the way the US has attempted to do. Instead, I see India operating as a resource for countries that want to democratize themselves. Just as India's own democracy is fundamentally homegrown. I mean, India's democracy does not derive from the United Kingdom. It does not derive from the United States. India has a homegrown democracy that was the outgrowth of its own independent struggle. In the same way, I don't see India trying to impose democracies in the world the way the United States has. Instead, I see India being a resource for countries that are trying to democratize, but maybe don't know quite how to do it. Which means that if you're trying to democratize a poor sub-Saharan African country, you might look to somewhere like Uttar Pradesh, which has a similar level of income. And you might say, well, if Uttar Pradesh can do it, so can Ethiopia. Methods that work in Uttar Pradesh should theoretically work in Ethiopia. Why? Because there's similar levels of resources. They're places that deal with similar problems, similar interethnic conflicts. They're all the same challenges that democracy faces in a poor Indian state like Uttar Pradesh are the kinds of challenges faced in a poor African country. And I think over time, we'll see democratizing African and maybe to a lesser extent, Middle Eastern countries looking to India for models of how to run their democracies. Now, as far as the G7 becoming a G8, honestly, I think there the learning will go the other way. And I don't think we need to, anyone should be arrogant about this, that India can only teach others or that India can only learn from others. I suspect what we'll see in the G7 is India learning from its G7 partners, and especially as it becomes an eighth member of the G7 to become a G8, learning from its partners who've been at this much longer, who are much more developed, how to liberalize its economy, how to better engage with global governance structures. I think India there will be the one learning how to better manage its economy in line with global standards, and how then to help shape global standards based on its own experiences in India. So learning goes both ways. I think there's potential both with the developing world and with the developed world for India to be more engaged without being militarily engaged. And that's the key. What we've seen from the US, from France, from the UK, and also from China, from Russia, is that their engagement with the world has been so heavily militarized, so thoroughly connected with their security apparatus in a way that India's engagement with the world simply is not. And I think that'll be very welcome both in the developing world, but also among the developed countries of the G7.
Yeah, very nice and amazing answer, Professor. I'd like to now welcome Dr. Tripathi to ask a question in the discussion forward. Please, Dr. Tripathi, I welcome you. Take the floor.
First of all, thank you so much, Professor Babones, for your insightful remarks on the questions moderated by the host. So thank you so much for joining us. Professor Babones, I have been following your insights on so many Indian platforms, especially like India Today, Conclave, and so many Indian social media platforms. So, and India's soft power. One question to you, which is, I think, most important for us, for all of us. How do you see that in the current configuration of geopolitics, India's voice is more assertive than ever? Even the front, world front is open. So how do you see the India's rising into the current trajectory of geopolitics?
The first thing is, I think we should be very cautious about simply accepting narratives that sound credible without subjecting them to scrutiny. So, for example, the widely held idea that India is being more assertive on the global stage, there's actually very little evidence of that. That is, India has not been insisting on shaping shaping the Russia-Ukraine war, or shaping security arrangements in West Africa, or been involved in the South China Sea dispute, which is to say that India, maybe uniquely among countries of its economic power, has not sought to throw its weight around on the global stage. So, of course, everyone's interested in India as a business opportunity, but that's very different from India using its power globally. I mean, really the only way in which India has been using its increasing prominence in the global stage has been in the very transactional sense of purchasing defense equipment. So India has quickly become a major defense export partner for France, a major defense export partner for the United States. But India has placed very few demands in return. I mean, if you look at India's top foreign policy priorities, well, being against terrorist financing. Well, India's pushing on an open door there. Everyone's against terrorist financing. I know India's particular interest is Pakistan, but that's not the global stage. That's the very local stage for India. India promoting sovereignty. Well, again, that's a widely held view around the world, and the entire developing world embraces this sovereignty narrative. It's not something that India is pushing on alone, or that India has a special interest in. Maritime security. Well, again, everyone shares an interest in maritime security. India joined the Quad to promote maritime security, but that's not really, that's not a very global or very demanding role that India is playing. So I'm not really sure that India is playing a larger role in global governance affairs. Everyone's more aware of India. India's growing economic power is very obvious and very present. But I'm not sure what it means to say India plays a greater role in world affairs unless we get down to specifics. And I find it hard to find specific areas in which India actually is playing a larger role.
Thank you so much, Professor Babones, for your insightful remarks. Now, the next question to you, and I think it is very important for all of us to understand your insights on this question. India has projected its soft power for centuries, long before the concept even was defined by the Joseph Nye.
Yes.
So, and India is an enlightened a nation with a vibrant philosophical contribution to humanity through yoga, Bollywood, and Ayurveda. Despite having such kind of potential of soft power, India couldn't project itself as a as a superpower soft power, as a great soft power in the global stage. How do you see? Where is India's lacking on this point?
First of all, I think we have to ask, what's India's goal here? Does India have the goal of being a soft power? I mean, obviously, throughout history, India has had that. The origins of Buddhism lie in India. There are even some evidence that the origins of Christianity may lie in India. India's been exporting mathematics to the world for 3,000 years. So India has a massive presence as a cultural exporter going back literally thousands of years. But it doesn't seem to me that India has attempted, that is, has had any national interest in leveraging this for its own goals. I mean, when we say soft power, Joseph Nye was very clear, that's a form of power. Means the ability to impose your will on others. And I've seen no evidence that India has any interest in imposing its national will on others. There just seems to be very little interest in India, certainly among India's foreign policy elite, in trying to impose an Indian view on other countries. Now, I think that's a good thing. I'm not criticizing that. I'm actually very much in favor of that. I think that's something India can be proud of. But, when we import, everyone thinks a concept like soft power, it sounds wonderful. And so, of course, India should want more of it. Well, power is power. Does India have any intention to wield its power? American soft power is wielded by the United States in the interests of U.S. foreign policy goals. Russia, to the extent it has also a lot of soft power, people forget that Russia is very effective in its propaganda operations, its news operations. I would encourage India and Indians to take one step back and ask, power for what purpose? So if India's goal is to pursue commercial advantage, yes, then soft power is useful. If India's goal is to pursue territorial gain, then yes, soft power is useful. But if India's goal is to promote a peaceful world where everybody is respected, well, I'm not sure power is useful for that. And this is at the heart. I mean, I don't mean to be too Gandhian here, but this is at the heart of Gandhi's message that, that there's no, that the goal of human domination is not a goal to be pursued. And if you're not pursuing that goal, you don't need power as such. Now everyone wants commercial advantage. And of course, it would be useful for India if it could better use yoga and Bollywood to get more contracts for Indian companies. And in that very kind of quotidian sense, soft power might be useful. But in terms of the national interest, in terms of the kinds of goals that are pursued by sovereign nations, I'm not sure that soft power has much utility for India. I mean, we might ask the same of hard power. What is hard power for? Well, hard power is for defending the country and defeating opponents. Well, India's hard power has been limited to the very modest goal of ensuring India's secure borders with Pakistan and China and suppressing maybe the irregular flows of smuggling from Myanmar. But where does India use its hard power with Bangladesh? Where does India use its hard power with Nepal, with Sri Lanka, with Bhutan? The answer is it doesn't, because India has friendly relations with most of its neighbors. It has no interest in using power against them. Well, the same question arises when you talk about soft power. For what goal would India use it? India, it seems to me, has historically only used power in the most extreme circumstances for national defense. I'm not sure that India needs soft power to accomplish its goals. It's all a matter of what goals India has and what goals you want for India. It always sounds good. If someone makes a global power ranking, everyone wants to climb up that global power ranking because national pride, you're more powerful. But I think it's important to step back and ask power for what purpose. So you tell me the purpose, and then I'll try to give you an answer as to what good soft power could do to meet that goal.
Professor, am I audible to you, Professor?
Do you agree with you that Professor, this India doesn't project itself as a soft power potential in hard terms, and India doesn't have a practice to settle down and frozen conflict to the soft power. But I think that when you are going to enter in an era of leadership, that means the entire world is looking for you. I think there must be some practice of your potential, like in diffusing the conflict, and they are so happy that our Prime Minister Modi, when he visits any country, and for deepening our relations. Thank you so much for your deep insights on this, and on these questions and on these important topics. And it might be a very, very insightful for our policymakers, especially Indian policymakers for the world. Thank you so much. Now I would like to hand over this session to again Nandini.
I would like to draw a question from your realistic perspectives and insights that you have just described, Professor. As India is not pursuing the power in its very realistic sense, if it is power, then there need to be some assertion of it. So I would like to question in the current configuration of geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific regarding India's soft power. As Quad exists there and also AUKUS exists there, how do you see India's going forward with the perspective of Quad? Is it just to countering the interest of another Asian big power, that is China, or is it just to yield India's more or harness more opportunities there in the Indo-Pacific in favor or in interest of India?
So first, AUKUS does not involve India, and frankly never will involve India. AUKUS is a very deep nuclear sharing agreement, not just nuclear propulsion, but nuclear responsibility sharing among the US, UK, and now Australia, and primarily because I think the US and UK needed to cover a greater geography in the world, including the Indian Ocean, as China continues to expand and as the Chinese nuclear threat expands. AUKUS is an anti-ballistic missile alliance, anti-submarine launched ballistic missile alliance. The attack submarines that form the core of AUKUS are there to counter Russian and Chinese nuclear missile ballistic submarines. None of that involves India in any way. So let's leave AUKUS aside. When we get to the Quad, of course, was founded as very much a hard power grouping of 4 countries to do maritime security. And although no one said it, they were fundamentally aligned to provide maritime security against Chinese aggression. China makes very extensive use of irregular maritime forces, so fishing fleets, and it's ships that are not military ships, but are Chinese maritime militia ships, right? So that are not registered to the Chinese PLA Navy. It uses them to pursue its expansion of its sovereign borders, to do all sorts of goals that are methods short of war. And so Quad was meant to counter these Chinese maritime security operations. So, for example, China might flood an area of ocean that it believes it has sovereignty over with 1,000 fishing boats. They're not actually there to fish. They're there to assert Chinese sovereignty over the area. And Quad was intended to keep track and to counter all of these Chinese, very expansionary Chinese maritime activities. But President Biden came in, and he was not an enthusiastic supporter of Quad. He redefined Quad from maritime security to being about 3 new purposes. Quad, according to President Biden, was supposed to focus on coronavirus cooperation, economic development, and global warming. Then we saw Anthony Albanese come to power in Australia, so a change of government from a liberal government that was very much committed to the Quad security mission to a Labour government that wanted a less confrontational attitude vis-a-vis China. So again, that aligned with bringing the defense cooperation out of the Quad, the maritime security cooperation out of the Quad. And then, of course, Japan had a change in prime ministers. I'm not sure what Prime Minister Kishida's position is in the Quad, but the death of Prime Minister Mori, who was very much aggressively in favor of the Quad, in fact, he's the one who floated the idea in the first place, means that Japan is not as connected anymore to this maritime security mission. So the Quad has really been left as an empty organization. Pursuing goals, well, the coronavirus goal is now irrelevant. Global warming is such a diffuse goal that it's not really going to be meaningfully a Quad goal. And regional development, well, yes, the Quad can do a few projects, but primarily it's the Asian Development Bank that does development in the region. So I don't think the Quad is any longer a meaningful vessel for cooperation with India. It may be resurrected at some point in the future. The Quad represents the closest India has ever come to being engaged outside of the Indian Ocean in a broader maritime security mission. But I don't think it's going to continue into the future.
Yeah. I'd like to ask another question, Professor, in this regard. As we are discussing the soft power potential of India in this 21st century, how do you see the leading role of India in its neighborhood, as India believes in coexistence and cooperation? But another power, which is also a big power and also a rising power and assertive power that exists with India in terms of its neighborhood. So how do you see India's approach in countering and cooperation with it?
India plays a very important regional stabilizing role, and it is able to play that role because no one fears Indian expansionism. Nobody believes India is trying to take territory or seabed away from its neighbors. As a result, India is able to exert a stabilizing influence. We see this most clearly with the collapse of the Rajapaksa government in Sri Lanka, and India stepping in to provide not only financial support, but direct food support to Sri Lanka. We also see it in Nepal, where China has been trying to get direct political influence in Nepal, but India plays a stabilizing role by supporting the Nepalese economy through the ability of Nepalese people to work in India, the ability of Nepalese people to serve in the Indian armed forces. Again, India helps stabilize the country against Chinese influence. I suspect we're seeing this informally in Myanmar. I don't know as much about it, but I do know that as the West has exited from Myanmar, the only democratic country that remains strongly engaged in Myanmar is India. And I even suspect that as Pakistan faces the potential for a complete social collapse with the potential Talibanization of Pakistan, I could even imagine that in the not too distant future, India would be called upon not to provide military support for Pakistan. That's obviously never going to happen for obvious reasons, but to provide financial and logistical and social support for Pakistan and for secular forces in Pakistan. I think you may find that becomes India's role sooner or later, and maybe sooner, whether India seeks that role or not, because simply put, a stable Pakistan is good for India. India has even been playing a stabilizing role in Afghanistan under the Taliban regime, when the entire West has pulled out of Afghanistan, but India is still there, trying to help stabilize the country. So, India's role as a regional stabilizer is really enabled by the fact that India does not have the ambition to wield power in its own national interest, but instead seems to simply want its neighbors to be stable and prosperous. That's not something you can say of China. It's not something you can say of Pakistan. It's not something you can really say of any of the other major countries in the region. Maybe if you go as far away as Thailand, you would find that sort of attitude in Thailand as well. So India is really an important force in the region, but a force for stability, not a force for expansionism. And that contrasts absolutely clearly with China's ambitions in the region.
Thank you, Professor. As your perspective on India is always amazing, and you are always positive about India's role in global configuration of powers and also yielding the growth together. So, I would like to ask you another question in this regard, Professor. As India is attempting to assert some amount of power and speaking about its ambition in its clear words, as it would have been ambiguous in some 5 years or 10 years ago. So, how do you see India's this assertion of changing attitude in terms of its foreign policy and in terms of it engaging with more vocally with the powers of the global conundrum?
I think there's been much more continuity than change in India's foreign policy. Continuity across governments and a high level of professionalization of India's Ministry of External Affairs. There doesn't seem to be a big change. I mean, India's increasing prominence, let's face it, is driven entirely by India's increasing GDP. Countries want to be part of the India growth story, and India has more money now to spend abroad on foreign aid and foreign assistance. So, India has become more important simply because it's become richer. But I don't think that's changed the overall goals of Indian policy or the overall respect with which India is seen in the world. I think that global and particularly regional respect for India has been there since the beginning of the Indian state. Remember that India was the first independence from Western colonialism, and India has been a beacon for the post-colonial world ever since Nehruvian times, right? So this is not something new. It's simply a continuation of India's historical role, but now with greater resources than it's ever had before.
Yeah. Yes, also it is absolutely true that Indian democracy it gets getting stronger day and day, and also India is realizing more powers in times to come, and also with growing days. And your trust in Indian power and your trust in India's future is so high, and I would like to be so appreciative of it. And I would like to ask you another question, Professor, that in Asia, India is a major power, and also in the West, India is a very acceptable power. So, how do you see India's vision of Asia? More stability in Asia, more cooperation in Asia, as SARC is irrelevant in today's time. So, how do you see India's role in stability and more cooperation in Asia, particularly when China is rising assertive about its power?
India is the only major status quo power in Asia. That is the only major country in Asia that is promoting stability as opposed to change. China, of course, is very aggressive on all of its frontiers. Lately, except for the Russian frontier, it used to be very aggressive even there. Now that's largely settled, but China's been very aggressive around its entire eastern and southern fringe, not just with India. Russia, of course, has been very aggressive, as we're seeing now in the war in Ukraine. Iran and Saudi Arabia have both been very aggressive historically, and Iraq, certainly under Saddam Hussein, but now more recently, Iraq has not had the national unity to be aggressive, but certainly Iran and Saudi Arabia are not complacent countries. They're countries that are fighting foreign wars by proxy in Syria, in Yemen. They're both very aggressive in their foreign policies. So if you look around India's neighborhood, maybe the only other country that comes to mind as a force for stability is Japan, of course, on the opposite side of Eurasia. Other than India and Japan, every other country in the region, major country in the region, seems to want something from somebody else. And of course, those are forces for instability in the region. So, I think it's a positive thing, the positive role that India is playing just to tend to tamp down international conflict, the same way Japan plays that role. Now, Japan has historically played that role with its money, not with its diplomacy. India, instead, being much poorer, has historically used its diplomacy to play that role. But either way, it's certainly something to be admired. It's something the world needs a lot more of.
Yeah. It's been such an engaging discussion with you, Professor. Your insights are always welcoming, and your insights are always helpful
Thank you.
for policymakers to understand and also take things forward and make a good discussion. And it's been a pleasure for me to talk to you in this podcast about various issues and various geopolitical aspects. So I would like to now welcome Dr. Tripathi, who is founder and president of FGS, to give a vote of thanks to end this session, and then we can have an informal conversation.
Thank you, Nandini, and thank you so much, Professor Babones, for your very highly insights remarks and your views on Indian democracy and your narratives on Indian soft power, Indian foreign policy is absolutely insightful for all of us, for researchers, for policymakers, for academicians, for business leaders, and for those who believe that expansionism is the last point, the reality of the realism that you refute. No, not now. Expansionism is not the final destination of the global order. It is somehow the India has the credibility to expand its soft power in terms of as stabilizer forces. And India is seen as a stabilizing forces in the region, in the neighborhood. And the kind of you have faith on India's foreign policy, India's leadership, that even if Pakistan is required, to resolve the crisis, the social crisis, India makes strength financial support. So this is somehow the India's the credential. This is some India's voice that is counted. I asked first question that why the India's voice is assertive than ever today. I think that your answer is your interpretation is the answer of this. Yes, if India's voices are counted and assertive than ever, just because of India's long-standing, credibility of world peace and the philosophy of humankind, humanity, and Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So thank you so much, Professor Babones, for your insightful remarks and for joining us at FGS. And I hope that in the future, we will be getting your insights. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nancy.
Pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.